Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome to another Sun Pirates TCG video. I'm your host today, Mohammed Fatah. Joining me is my lovely co-host, Colin Wong.
What up, what up?
And today we're going to be presenting for you guys our Reiju analysis featuring builds and tech choices for the Reiju deck from OP06. So to start us off, we're going to be looking at the version of the deck that plays all four Rangers. Primarily it's playing Yonji, the Green Ranger. The small Yonji is a 2-mana 2K that has the same text all the other small Rangers have. Dawn -1 turn into the big one, which is a 4-mana 5K that is a blocker and gets +1K if you have equal or fewer Dawn than your opponent. This is an example deck list from Ryan George, who got 15th place in the Carta Magica Online Regional a couple weeks back, as of time of this recording.
Yeah.
So important notes with this build is just... the biggest pro is you just have a bigger burst turn with Judge. A lot of the decks that are in the format right now clear based on cost, and just putting an extra 4-drop into play makes it that much harder for them to deal with your Judge turn. It also gives you a cheap blocker that you can put into play, since you play a 2-mana 6K blocker effectively. It's just like very stat efficient. By contrast, the biggest cons for the deck is, as you can see on this deck list, a lot of the piece numbers change and you lose a lot of your tech spaces. So you only have 3 and 3 of the Nijis, 2 and 2 of the Yonjis. You don't have very much wiggle space for tech options. He's playing a Gion, but he also only has a total of 10 2Ks, where most of the lists have 11 plus. And then as well, the big Yonji, the 4-mana Yonji, doesn't have any on-play text, so if you're hard casting him while you're at less Dawn, he just doesn't get any immediate value. It relies on your opponent not having a follow-up to it.
Yeah, the consistency is a big factor with this build, where as opposed to the other build that we will show you very soon, with the Yonji you have to basically find both pieces, the small Yonji and the big Yonji, to maximize your Judge turns.
Right. You do get very, very explosive Judge turns, because even if your entire board was cleared the turn before, you put an 8-8, a 4-5, a 5-6, a 4-6, and a 7-7 into play, so you build a full 5-character board off of one card. But because you have to see all your pieces so quickly, usually in around 5 or 6 turns, you just sacrifice a lot of your consistency, and your earlier turn plays become much more awkward. To look at the more standard build now, we're going to be looking at Clarence Audrey David, pardon me if I mispronounced that, who got 6th place at the Core TCG Regional also a couple of weeks back as of time of this recording. So he primarily is playing 4 of each of the more powerful Rangers, the Reiju, the Niji, and the Ichiji. He's playing 12 2Ks, as we mentioned previously. Because he's not playing the Yonjis, he gets to increase his 2K and his counter density. He's also teching in the Queen blocker. So to touch on a few of these, the pros for this is you just will more consistently see your 3 big Rangers. They all have on play text. They all get immediate value after you've Dawn -1 time in a game. You gain access to the Queen blocker. It's also a 6K blocker, and it costs 5, but it synergizes with your leader since it has the Dawn minus on play, so you get to gain more value from your leader. And you also get more space, like we said, for tech cards, more 2Ks. He was playing the Gion. You can play Pudding. He was also playing that. The con to this is your Judge turn is less explosive. Notably, it is still very hard to clear the 8-drop, the 5-drop, the 4-drop, and the 7-drop. Coming from the Sakazuki side, especially since your Niji can answer a Kuzan.
Same with Moria too.
Yeah, exactly. He can bounce the Morias or any black deck really's Kuzan that they put into play the previous turn, so they just lose that free shrinker and have to use more cards out of their hand. But it is still a downside, since you lose the extra body if you're coming from a board with nothing.
I will say too, though, the lack of the Yonji makes it a little bit less safe to go for the Judge play. So in this build, you're not producing a blocker as opposed to the other build with Yonji. So you do want to make sure you're at a healthier life total, at least, I would say usually at least 2 life, to pull off the Judge play without dying on the crackback. Unless, of course, the only body your opponent has in play is basically nothing, or they only have their leader to work with. Then obviously there's context there, but
right, like everything's situational, but also like without the Yonji, like the cheapest blocker that this version has access to is the Queen. So notably, this version will like have more. I mean, this deck has trouble into Yamato already, but technically the Yonji version has a bit more of an advantage since you can play a cheap blocker. But regardless, both versions have their like strengths and weaknesses, but most people prefer the consistency of playing the non-Yonji build, especially since it opens up access to tech choices such as Charlotte Pudding. You saw this in the previous list he was playing as a 2 of, but some of the benefits of this card is that it parses down lower hands. Since it has on play, your opponent shuffles their hand back into their deck, then draws 5 cards. We've seen Whitebeard do a little bit in this format. Recently, you get to parse down his hand. Normally, Whitebeard has a 10, 11 card hand after he's taken his life. If you shuffle it down and turn it into 5, he just lost 6 cards. Usually, that just puts you in a very big advantageous position. You can also combine it with the small Niji on 7 Dawn. You can play the small Niji for 3, use him to turn into big Niji, bounce a 4 into their hand, and then shuffle it away with the Pudding after drawing your card for your leader. It just can get rid of a problem 4-drop. Also notably, it can shuffle away cards that your opponent searched, even if their hand's not above 5, if it's at 5 or 6. If your Moria on the previous turn just like hog-backed and added big Moria back to his hand, or if your like Sakazuki opponent searched some important piece off of their brand new or their Tashigi, you could just shuffle it away and mess up their curve. Also, if your opponent just like snap kept their opening hand and didn't mulligan, you can shuffle it away to disrupt their curve or disrupt the pieces they wanted to see. And also the benefit of this is that it can potentially disrupt your opponent's bottom deck stack. It's not super relevant in this format, but some decks have access to it. Sakazuki does a lot more searching now, so shuffling up his bottom deck can be very relevant.
Yeah, especially when you get into the grind game, which that can happen versus the Sakazuki matchup, where you want to be playing pretty defensively so you can make sure you can judge safely. So it is possible for Sakazuki to just be accumulating advantage through their Tashigis and brand news, and particularly with Tashigi setting up their bottom like 16 to 20-ish cards or so. So definitely the Pudding can be relevant there,
especially in tandem with like Rob Lucci putting 3 more cards at the bottom of their deck when they like put like their Hound Blazes or anything that they're expecting to cycle back into. If you shuffle it up, yes, they're in a random location now, but also your opponent's not guaranteed to like have it where they want it to be. Moving on, we're going to discuss the Gion that we saw in the Yonji list. It is a tech that some of the lists have been playing. It just gives you more 2k counters in the deck to increase your counter density, to make guarding much easier, and it's also very strong into the Nami matchup. Once per turn when they use an event on your turn, they just have to put a card from their hand at the bottom of their deck. It just is the
it makes the matchup free.
What Nami wants to do, right? If you ever put this into play, they have to brick fist it, or I don't even. Does Zeph bounce 4s?
No, he bounces a 3 or less. So the matchup literally becomes free if you summon Gion.
If your opponent's brick fisting your Gion and then you play it the next turn, they're not in a good spot.
Speaking of Nami, though.
Speaking of Nami, this list also does play one of the Nami choices, Gum Gum Giant Gavel. It lets you put pieces into your graveyard. So, for example, Ichiji can't be countered with, unlike all the others big rangers. So if you don't see your kingdom, or if you have too many of them, you can just trash it to counter for 4. It does also mill 2 to potentially mill pieces, but you're not really relying on your mill to find your pieces. And yeah, similarly, it can just like turn bricks in your hand, like extra copies of Stage, extra copies of Ichiji, just into a free 2k basically. Just it and the card each become 2ks.
Yeah, and a small call out to other event counter options like Gum Gum Jet Gatling provides a similar role where you can quote unquote turn your bricks into counter by discarding your non-counter cards to basically get like a little bit higher on a counter value.
Notably, Gatling does also let you potentially cheese, and just like instead of doing your tag outs early, you could just if you trigger it, you can just ramp your Dawn and then gun to a judge immediately for value, which is also an option.
Right.
We also have a tech choice that they've been playing from set 6 itself, Black Bug. Notably, it's just a searchable removal spell. It has the same text as the big rangers. If your Dawn is less than or equal to your opponents, place one of their 5 or lesses at the bottom of their deck. Bottom decking is just really, really strong this format. You get to bomb deck highly sought after black pieces like Perona, Rob Lucci, Absalom from Moria and Sakazuki, or Kikunojo and Perospero from Katakuri. You just don't want to trigger their on-KO effects, and for the black cards that we've mentioned, you don't want to put them back into their yard, since they gain access to it again with their Gecko Morias, or as the Gecko Moria leader, just with his own text.
Yeah, and a big point too is that, remember, as we said earlier, your main objective as a Reiju player is to stay alive until the end game, because you have that inevitability with the super big judge play, right? So just being able to get rid of an attacker, like basically no questions asked, lets you get into that stage of the game.
Exactly, and the biggest strength of this deck is just like the amount of value that your leader can accrue. Like, you don't have to go for an immediate judge. There are matchups where you can just Dawn minus every single turn and just like draw 2 cards, similar to what Edward Newgate from OPO2 did. Yes, Edward Newgate is a 6k base leader, but like drawing an extra card every turn and setting up a board and just accruing this value can just like sometimes force your opponent into these very bad situations. And that's just exactly what this deck wants to do, and why having access to so many options is very powerful. Other than that, guys, thank you guys so much for watching. This has been another Sun Pirates TCG video. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. What tech cards would you play? Would you play Yonji instead? Other than that, I've been your host, Mohammed Fatah, and I'll see you guys in the next one.
Thanks, guys.